Okay, welcome. No, that's terrible. Okay, welcome. I'll start again. Well, hello again. We're into 7501 NCS, more than likely by now, airline management. And this is lecture 3. It's a synopsis lecture and it's about decision making and effective communications. As I've mentioned before, this synopsis lecture is not the whole lecture, it's just a little slice of it to indicate to you the range of topics that we cover. And you should be using the full version of the lecture for study and reference purposes. So we're up to now lecture 3, decision making and effective communications. And some of the aspects that I'll be talking during this course, lecture, is about decision making, effective communications, and again the traditional learning points at the end. So let's have a look at decision making and effective communications. Firstly, decision making. So this lecture examines how managers make decisions and explores how individual, group and organisational factors affect the quality of decisions they make and thus determine organisational performance. Decision making is difficult for many people, and what you need to do is to be able to collect as much information you can as possible before making that decision. Otherwise you'll make a poor decision. So every time a manager, going back to Fayol's functions, management functions, every time a manager plans, organises, leads or controls, they make a stream of decisions. So it's important, very important for us to understand the decision-making process. So decision-making, what is it? It's the process by which managers respond to opportunities and threats that confront them by analysing the opportunities and making determinations or decisions about specific organisational goals and the courses of action. So a good result or a good decision results in the selection of appropriate goals and courses of action that increase organisational performance. If you remember, a manager is there to increase organisational performance, and so you need good decision making. We make two different types of decisions. We make those program decisions. They're the routine types of decisions which we make using past experience. So when I'm driving and I pull up at a stop sign, I remember it's a program decision, I'm going to stop. My body does it subconsciously, and that is program decision making. Non-program decision making is when there's non-routine decisions. So as I'm pulling up at that intersection, a car comes through, or as happened to me this morning, pulled up at a traffic light and the traffic light went green and a car came from the right going through the red light. Then I was faced with a non-program decision. And non-program decisions, I use my intuition to make a decision. I use my judgment, or I use creativity to come up with the right choice. And almost everything a manager does involves decision making. And as we said before, some are routine and others are complex. There is a rational decision making model that we talk about on the full lecture, and it's quite simple about identifying the problem. And a lot of these models rely on agreeing. If there's more than you, if there's a group, you need to identify the problem, or you need to understand what it is that you need to make a decision about. And you and I, in a group situation, need to have the same meaning. Identify the decision criteria. We allocate weights to the criteria. We develop alternatives. We analyse, conduct an analysis of the alternatives. We select the best alternative. We implement the chosen alternative, and we evaluate the decision's effectiveness. If it's not working, we go around again. So I'm standing here, and the problem is I need to get from A to B. What's the decision-making criteria? I need to identify that. So of the various ways I could do it, I allocate weights and so on and so forth, and I go around the model. The decision-making has an underlying assumption of rationality. One of the aspects of it is that we are trying to come up with the right answer based on all the factors that we know. So the problem needs to be clear and unambiguous. It needs to be to have single and well-defined goals. All alternatives and consequences should be known, and the preferences are clear. So the preferences in the sense of what it is that we would prefer to include in our decision-making process as we go along, and that the preferences are constant and stable. So from that perspective, there's this underlying assumption that we're going to make a rational decision of what is best for the long term. And that leads us to the final choice to maximise the payoff. There's also what they call bounded rationality, and I won't go into this in great detail here in this synopsis lecture, but bounded rationality is the fact that we can't have perfect information. You know, if I make a decision, for example, to build a house, I can't have perfect knowledge about every building process. So what I do is I make a decision using what they call bounded rationality, and I say to myself, I'm going to build that house, and I make that decision, and then as I go along, I'll build in the information that I need to achieve my goal. Often you also need to make decisions with regards not having perfect knowledge. Sometimes you know you don't have perfect knowledge, but you need to accept that what you know, on what you know, you need to make the decision and move forward. And again, that's another example of bounded rationality. The story about the mouse and the cheese is interesting. There's also escalation commitment. That's one of those words that I have trouble saying. It's influenced by the organisation's culture, internal politics and power. Good example of this in Australia of escalation commitment is the health system. The government, if they could start with a clean sheet of paper, would have a very different health system what they have. But what we already have in place is very complex, very cumbersome, and it's very difficult now to start from the beginning. And that's what happens in organisations. Often the project might be a pet project of the boss, and regardless of whether it's right or wrong, you're going to pursue it. So that is escalation commitment. And you continue to pour resources into it, albeit you know that there is more optimal ways of going forward. The conditions of decision making. When we make decisions with certainty. I know all the facts. I can now make a decision with a level of certainty. I can make a decision with risk factors involved, in the sense that there's a likelihood something might happen, or if it does happen, some consequences from it, and I need to accept that risk in making the decision. And often we're faced with uncertainty. You know, we're going to go through that door over there, but we're uncertain if there's something behind it that may harm us. So often we need to make decisions that have uncertainty as a condition. Really important often in life to sit back and reflect on when I'm making this decision. Am I making it with certainty? Am I making it with some risk involved? Or is there a level of uncertainty? If there's a high degree of uncertainty, often you might wish to delay the decision until you can build more certainty into it. People have different decision-making styles, and some people have a high tolerance for ambiguity, and other people have different ways of thinking. If you're a very rational person, or you can be a very intuitive person, you can have a low tolerance for ambiguity or a high one. And this leads to 4 different decision-making styles of being analytical, being conceptual, being behavioural, or being directive. So, in an aviation sense, if you're a pilot, you need to have a rational way of thinking. Your degree of ambiguity needs to be low, so therefore you have a directive method of decision making, for example. My wife, in particular, is more intuitive than I am, and she has a high tolerance for ambiguity, so she's more conceptual. So different people have different decision-making styles, and again, we need to understand that, not only about ourselves, but about our staff. When we're making decisions, there's all sorts of errors and biases. There's overconfidence. There's people sometimes seek immediate gratification. You know, should I buy this new power tool? And the answer, yes, because I want immediate gratification. And there's all sorts of other biases that run around that are shown in this slide that we'll cover in the full lecture. Sometimes escalation commitment, for example, is like sunk costs. We've already got so much money committed to this project. We're going to stay committed to it. And so that's an error and a bias because of the fact that it's escalation commitment. Some people, I worked with a boss once, he had availability bias, one shown at the bottom, and he just grabbed whatever decision he first thought of, and that's what he said, let's go that way. Hindsight bias, I might talk about very quickly, is one where we beat ourselves to death that if we had that decision over again, we would have made a different, come up with a different solution. The decision-making process by groups is really interesting, and again I cover that in more detail in the full lecture, but brainstorming is one decision-making tool for groups that I just want to talk about quickly because it's about open and freewheeling discussions with no power on the table. Everyone comes as an equal. So there's no criticisms being ruled out. Freewheeling, let's just think of everything we can and consider it and the aspects of it. Quantity is what require you collect as many different thoughts as you possibly can. And piggybacking, everyone is encouraged to suggest how others' ideas can be turned into new ideas, or how two or more ideas can be joined into still another idea. So this is about brainstorming, a very, very effective tool to be used for groups in decision making. I'm a very visual person, so I like to use things like whiteboards. I like to use my hands and to write on pieces of paper because that's my decision-making style. And again, you need you need to allow them to use their own individual decision-making styles in that group to come up with an answer for the way ahead. Let's move on from decision-making. We're going to talk about, in the lecture, about effective communications. And communication is the sharing of information between two or more people or groups to reach a common understanding. So it involves a transfer and understanding of meaning. So me now, I'm communicating with you, I'm transferring and understanding meaning. Well, hopefully you're understanding the meaning. There's a large part that happens with communication. So not only what I'm saying, it's how I'm looking, whether I'm looking directly in your eye, showing a level of honesty in what I say, a level of sincerity. So we learn a lot in communications about non-verbal skills, what are called non-verbal skills. And it's a very interesting area of communications. The communications process consists of two phases. There's the transmission phase, what I'm doing here, the information is shared between two or more individuals or groups, and the feedback phase, so that a common understanding is achieved. And we have problems here in this medium with the feedback phase. I don't know what you're thinking, I don't know what your thoughts are. I can't build a common understanding with you. And we achieve that through classroom interaction or through emails for online students and or classroom students as well. But also through the process of the assessment items, and that's where I get the feedback phase from you on your learning journey. But between that communication, there is what they call noise. While I'm talking to you, for example, at the moment, you might have a young child at home who's running around. You may be sitting in a noisy bar drinking a beer while you watch this lecture. So all of that is noise. It's stopping you from getting the full intent of my transmission. Managers need good communication skills. They need to be oral. You need to have good oral communication skills. You need to have good written communication skills. And you also need to have good non-verbal communication. So they all add up to your skill set, your communication skill set as a manager. What's effective communications? And effective communications is those in which the intended meaning of the source and the perceived meaning of the receiver are one and the same. So effective, if I say to you, stand on your head, and you stand on your head, that's effective communications. Efficient communications is communication at a minimum cost in terms of resources expended. So, for example, if I need to communicate with my staff, the most effective way of doing it may be to talk to them individually. If I've got 5 staff, that's very doable, very achievable. If I've got an organisation that's got 5,000 staff, the most efficient way to communicate to them may be to send out an email or a news bulletin or something of that order. So often efficient and effective need to be looked at when you want to pass strong messages to your staff. Modern managers, in performing their various roles and tasks, spend most of their time communicating, and some researchers show that managers are involved in some form of communication up to 85% of their time. I can only talk about when I was a senior manager in an organisation. I did most of my work on the computer, most of my reports, responded to emails. The majority of all of that was done out of office hours. During the day, I was committed to interacting with people and communicating. When managers and other members of an organisation are ineffective communicators, organisational performance suffers. So if you have an organisation where people aren't communicating with each other, well, how can you have good performance? Managers need to select an appropriate communications medium for each message they send. There's 6 sources of noise common to most interpersonal exchanges: physical distractions, semantic problems. You find some people use language that other people can't understand. There's a cultural difference. I might say something to you. I work often in Indonesia, and I'm quite aware of cultural difference. I might say something to them that in my culture is very acceptable, whereas they take a different interpretation in their culture. I might be sending you mixed messages. Yes, John, you're doing really good at work. And also the absence of noise. I'm in that situation now. There's an absence of feedback, and so therefore that is adding noise. And there's also the status effects. And the status effects in aviation human factors, we call it the power-distance relationship, where you have someone who's powerful and someone who is less powerful. And so that's a status effect. So when my wife, for example, says to me something, there's a status effect there. I don't really hear what she's saying. I just try and pick up on the intent of what she wants done, and I do it, regardless of understanding the full communications. Because I'm human, I'm a male, I'm human, and that's the way life is. Cultural, I'll just talk about cultural quickly. People have all sorts of different, in their cultural background, they have all sorts of different cultural circles. There's the national one, there's your own personal spiritual one, your professional one, your organised. There's a family, there might even be a family cultural circle in there. So we as human beings have built up a large bank of cultural aspects that we consider. Critical feedback. Let's talk about critical feedback. If you're a manager, you often need to provide critical feedback, and you shouldn't be frightened of doing it. But the most effective way of doing it is to get to the point. You need to describe the situation in specific terms. You need to mutually agree on the sources of the problem and the solution with the person that you're talking to. And you end by having the subordinate summarise the meaning of the solution. So you get to the point, you describe the specific situation or the problem, you discuss that problem with them, and then you get them to conclude, if you like, to summarise the meaning and also to propose a solution. And if there's any chance of the person who you're providing this critical feedback to of having a hostile response, please get someone to sit in and take notes. That tends to moderate their behaviour. Simplifying the language as a barrier to good communications. Again, we spoke about noise, semantics, and again that picks up on this point where people can use very complex words or words that you have no meaning to. Aviation has its own taxonomy, words that we know. So there you go. What does taxonomy mean? Do you know what that means? So I've gone past using simple words so therefore my communication is now falling down. You may ask one of the recipients of a proposed piece of written work to read it first to ensure that it's understood. Active listening. Active listening is one of those things to get past the barriers. And some people are exceptionally good at listening. Again, my wife is an extremely good active listener. And being a good listener is important, and possibly more important than being an accurate sender. And an active listener needs to be empathetic. You need to avoid interrupting the speaker. You need to ask questions. Wait till they finish. Don't ask them halfway through by interrupting. Don't over-talk them. Make eye contact with them. Exhibit affirmative head nods, and avoid distracting actions or gestures when you're talking to them. So it's one of those things when you're going to have an important discussion with your boss, and while you're talking to them, they're busy doing emails. You know that there's a large barrier being set up to the quality of that communication. In the full lecture, I talk about Continental Airlines as a case study, and all the lectures use the contemporary industry and some historical case studies to make the points. Unfortunately, in the synopsis lecture, we don't have time to go through them, but there is a high element of using the contemporary industry in particular in making some of the teaching points. Learning outcomes, again, all of the lectures have learning points at the end of them, which will assist you to build your knowledge and also prepare you for the end of semester exam. So, decision making, we've talked about that, we've talked about effective communications, we've put down some learning points, and again, this is the third lecture, so at this stage you should be almost finished From Worst to First, Gordon Bethune's book. Next week, if you want to do some pre-reading, next week we start looking at interpersonal skills and delegation. Again, some really interesting work has been done there by academics over the years, and there's some very good contemporary examples of where interpersonal skills and delegation work and don't work. So I look forward to seeing you for the next lecture. I hope you've enjoyed lecture 3, the synopsis lecture on decision making and effective communications. So thank you very much. See you next lecture.